Hello, MCU fans. Today we're going to have a serious talk about the Phase 4 timeline and why it is so confusing and controversial. I mean, in general, Phase 4 has given us a lot of good movies and TV shows. All of these are now playing on Disney Plus, and throw in the two that aren't on Disney Plus yet, which would be No Way Home and Thor: Love and Thunder. And this has been a pretty good phase. I mean, yeah, hit or miss with some of the movies and TV shows. They weren't all perfect, but really, in general, we've gotten some pretty good stuff. But the timeline has been incredibly confusing. So why is that? I mean, phases 1 through 3 weren't perfect from a timeline standpoint, and it did take, over time, a little bit of moving things around to get it all perfect. But for the most part, there's no big controversies between what Marvel says and what the fans feel. But man, Phase 4, the same cannot be said. So let's dive right in and see if we can figure out why this has happened. So some of the things were out of Marvel's control. It feels like forever ago, but if you remember, James Gunn was fired from Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 due to some tweets that he had done back in the past, and Marvel felt like they had no other option but to let him go. But why I bring that up is Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 originally was going to kick off Phase 4. So right off the bat, the lead movie that was going to take us into outer space for Phase 4 wasn't going to happen now. Now, of course, he was rehired, but at the time, Marvel didn't know that was going to happen. So they had to completely change things around and start Phase 4 with a different movie than they had originally planned. But while this was obviously not something Marvel had wanted to have to deal with, boy, it was nothing compared to how the pandemic thoroughly wrecked the Marvel release schedule. You remember Black Widow? It was supposed to come out in May 1st of 2020. Well, it was over a year before it actually came out. So, in fact, we didn't get anything in 2020. Then, thank goodness for Disney Plus, because we started getting things on Disney Plus. But even in that case, WandaVision and Falcon and the Winter Soldier switched places. Perhaps because the filming schedule was much more difficult for Falcon and the Winter Soldier. But either way, those switched order. Also, because Black Widow was so delayed, it came out after Falcon and the Winter Soldier. But there's a reason that Marvel had it in this order, because Val and her appearance with recruiting Yelena at the end of Black Widow was supposed to happen before Val then shows up in Falcon and the Winter Soldier and recruits U.S. Agent. So they had to probably change around some dialogue and refilm some scenes for that. But nothing was as much of a pain for poor Marvel as Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. It got delayed over a year, but No Way Home, Spider-Man's third movie, which doesn't show up here because it's on Sony's release schedule, but if you remember, that came out at the end of 2021. So Multiverse of Madness actually came out after No Way Home. Well, why is that important? Well, because when Multiverse of Madness was first, it was supposed to introduce America Chavez, who then shows up in No Way Home, and she was going to be the reason that the Spider-Men were portaled in and made their appearances. But now with Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness after No Way Home, that left them having to come up with a different reason. And of course, the idea of Ned being able to use a sling ring was thrown in. To some success or maybe not, depending on whether you liked that plot line. But really, that was never their intent. So if you think about the pandemic, it's amazing we got anything, really, from Marvel in Phase 4. I mean, it's a Herculean effort that they were able to pull it off, what we got. So you have to give Marvel a little bit of slack for things feeling a little disjointed, a little out of order because of the pandemic and having to deal with that. But I don't believe all the problems are ones that Marvel couldn't have prevented. So let's look at some other things that Marvel could address and should address going forward. Dialogue really matters. It matters to fans. If it's in a movie, we pay attention to it. And in Eternals, there was a quote by Ajak that 5 years ago, Thanos erased half the population of the universe, delayed the emergence, but the people of this planet brought everyone back with the snap of a finger. And they even used this quote in the trailers for the movie. So what are we naturally going to think? Eternals is 5 years after Infinity War. Infinity War is in 2018, therefore Eternals is in 2023. And you can tell by their clothing, it's late fall, winter time frame, so awesome. November time frame of 2023. Boom, done. Well, not where Disney Plus placed it, which we're going to see. So, if we're going to put dialogue in a movie, Marvel should make sure that it fits with where they're going to place it. We suffered through the 8 years later graphic in Spider-Man Homecoming that was so wrong. So, people are really paying attention to this, or hoping that we don't have those situations again. But there's a bigger issue even than just the dialogue. I think what really has plagued Marvel in Phase 4, and I just don't remember this happening to this degree in previous phases, is I don't think the creative teams know the timeline placement when they're going to give interviews for the release of a movie or a TV show. For example, Thor: Love and Thunder. Taika Waititi says, regarding how much time has passed since we've seen Thor, I think probably the number of years since we've seen Endgame. It's probably 4 years. Is that right? I don't know. Is it? We're looking to him for guidance here. Now, granted, he can be a prankster, so maybe he wasn't even being serious. But the bottom line is, there's just no way it was 4 years since Endgame. Endgame is 2023. 4 years later is 2027. I just don't think Thor: Love and Thunder happens in 2027. So you're left wondering, does Taika even know? That would be strange that Marvel wouldn't tell him. Then we look over at like Sam Raimi. Now this quote sounds a little more solid. Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness picks up roughly a few months after the events of Spider-Man No Way Home. Boom. Okay. So we know that No Way Home ends in December, because Spider-Man's swinging over New York at Christmas time. All right, so then a few months later, February, March. Done. Easy, right? Well, not necessarily, because that's not where Disney Plus is going to place the movie. So you're left wondering, did Marvel just not tell Sam Raimi what they were going to do? And again, let me be clear. I'm not blaming the creative team for these quotes. I'm not, saying, oh, they're just clueless or whatever. No, they're saying what they thought was true. The issue is that Marvel is not telling them what they're about to do. In some of these cases, stuff is going to show up on Disney Plus just a few months later. So how can Marvel not have told them, hey, this is what we're going to do. Please say this if you get asked about timeline placement. So let's look at some more. Eternals. Nate Moore says Eternals happens right around the same time as Far From Home, with the world recovering from the attack of Thanos and the return of half the world population. Now, interestingly, this is around the time that Marvel does actually place it on the Disney Plus timeline, but it doesn't fit well with that dialogue we heard earlier. That placed it in 2023, but we know that Far From Home is mid-2024. So which is it? Do we pay attention to what Nate Moore says, or do we pay attention to the line in the movie? These are self-inflicted wounds by Marvel. This is not because of the pandemic. This is them just not getting their ducks in a row. She-Hulk. Jessica Gao says She-Hulk is set not too far after Shang-Chi. It's not like years later. It's a relatively short amount of time. Okay, we're gonna take your word on that it's not long after Shang-Chi. So we'll keep that in mind, because when we look at the Disney Plus timeline, it is a while after Shang-Chi. But that's not what Jessica Gao said, so we're going to trust that until we know different, right? Then we look at Moon Knight, and this one's probably the most frustrating and disappointing. So poor Mohammed Diab. He says, the Marvel world is so complex. We had a date, we had a year, but I'm not going to say it just because it doesn't matter anymore. Can you just sense the defeated nature of his soul? I mean, it's strongly believed, that he put major Easter eggs in Moon Knight to make it clear when he was saying it took place. And people way smarter than me who understand phases of the moon believe that's the Easter egg. And that if you track the phases of the moon, because the moon is very prominent throughout Moon Knight, obviously, it places it clearly in June of 2024. I mean, crystal clear. But that is not where Disney Plus is going to place it. So I think in this case, you actually have Mohammed Diab being aware that his show is not going to be placed in the timeline where he thought it should have been, and where he actually baked in to the show. So, what a bummer. He worked that hard for Marvel to, switch it. Then Miss Marvel. Such an interesting quote. So I think right now we haven't put an official number on how many years have gone by since Endgame. I can't tell you off the top of my head because I would butcher it. It feels like it's 1 to 2 years, something like that, but I don't actually remember. Sigh. And again, I'm not blaming her for this quote. I'm blaming Marvel for not telling her what they're going to do with the timeline. I mean, obviously, she doesn't really care per se how long it is after Endgame. Is it 1 year? Is it 2 year? She was just making a series, and it's a great series. I love Miss Marvel. So why would Marvel not tell her, hey, when you go out and get asked this question, say that it's 2 years, or that it's 1 year, or it's a year and a half? I mean, they know. With the TV shows, they show up on the Disney Plus timeline probably weeks, less than weeks sometimes after these interviews. It just doesn't make sense. So again, I feel terrible for the creative team being sent out with no information and then in many times being contradicted when they try to give information. So Marvel's got to fix this. It just makes no sense why they would not let the creative team know what they're going to do with the timeline placement. So I think that's the biggest issue, but there are other problems. We've got several examples where real-world festivals are now being featured in the shows and movies, which is great. It adds culture to them. We learn about different countries. We learn about different religions. It's great. I am including Far From Home here because while it is a Phase 3, the last of Phase 3, it's so deep into Phase 4 in the timeline that it's actually pretty relevant to the discussion. So take Far From Home, for example. The event featured is the Festival of Lights, and the timing in the real world, at least, is October on an annual basis. But anybody that's seen Far From Home knows it doesn't take place in October. It takes place over Peter Parker's summer break, June to July. So, it's just misleading and confusing when something that has a real date and time is not featured in the movie around that date and time. And John Watts has even admitted, hey, this is not when the Festival of Lights happens. I know that, I'm sorry. And again, I'm not knocking Marvel for doing their best to put in the cultural events. I'm just saying Marvel's got to understand this is going to lead to confusion then. It's going to lead to confusion if you don't make them happen at the same time they do in the real world. So we look at Shang-Chi. Shang-Chi is even more integral to the plot. I mean, Festival of Lights was just kind of in the background of Far From Home, but Qingming Festival is literally the one time a year that you can enter Ta Lo. And knowing that it happens in 2024, the movie, we can therefore place the Chinese Festival of Qingming at its date of April 4th and 5th, so beginning of April. So, okay, Shang-Chi happens in April, right? Well, we're going to see that is not where Disney Plus places it on the timeline. So are we saying then that the festival just happens at a different time in the MCU? What's going on? And you can see these are the things that make people go, well, maybe just the Disney Plus timeline is wrong, which, by the way, I'm open to that. But Disney doesn't seem to be changing it. And I'm sure they see all these people, making all these comments saying it doesn't make sense. It's all messed up. But Marvel's sticking to it. So where does that leave us? Is it really in April? And the last example of this concept is in Ms. Marvel. Ms. Marvel features an Eid celebration. It happens to be the second one because there's two Eids. In this case, the celebration occurs in June 6th through 7th of 2025, and we know Ms. Marvel is in 2025, so that would mean Ms. Marvel is in June, right? Well, this one's interesting. The placement on the timeline in Disney Plus doesn't necessarily preclude it from being in June, but much of the show implies that it's at the beginning of Kamala's junior year, i.e. September-ish, not the end of her junior year, i.e. June. And I've done videos on all these different things. You can watch the different videos to get a lot of the details behind the whys of some of this stuff. But just believe me, the show just screams beginning of her year. So we're left again wondering then, do we believe the June because of the Eid celebration, or do we believe September because that's what the show seems to indicate? So yeah, I think there's an issue with using these festivals and using them at dates other than when they're actually placing the show. It's just very confusing. Then there's a couple other smaller issues, but it still leads to a lot of confusion. Some movies appear to happen inside the runtime of other movies. So you remember in Avengers, after the big battle, Loki is put in chains by Thor, and then immediately appears in Thor the Dark World before Odin, still in chains and ready to be punished. Well, so then Does that mean that Thor: The Dark World happens after Avengers? Sort of. The beginning of it does, but then there's over a year difference between the beginning of the movie and the end of the movie. And in between that, Iron Man 3 occurs, because we know that Iron Man 3 is Christmas of 2012, the same year as Avengers. And then the rest of Thor: The Dark World occurs in the end of 2013, probably around November of 2013. So, it's okay. There's nothing wrong with this, but it just leads to confusion when a movie is in the middle of another movie. Because now, in the Disney Plus timeline, do you place Thor: The Dark World after Avengers, or do you place Iron Man 3 after Avengers? You could argue either one. Disney Plus went ahead and put Thor: The Dark World, but that's led to a lot of confusion because people are like, no, Iron Man 3 happens before. So, it's fine that this happens, but it's confusing. So we do see this happening in Phase 4. Spider-Man No Way Home is actually a long duration. It starts in July, right after Far From Home, and ends in December with him swinging over the city. Now, we thought from Sam Raimi's quote that Multiverse of Madness was several months later, which would be fine. That would place it well after Hawkeye. However, we're going to see from the Disney Plus timeline that they place it in November. Now, that actually does fit with the trees. If you notice, the trees are basically the same amount of leaves are off. It does look more like November than February of the following year. But that means then the entirety of Multiverse of Madness happens before the end scene in Spider-Man, which is in December. That's confusing. It's hard to wrap your head around a little bit. Then after that, of course, is Hawkeye in Christmas of the 2024. But, again, nothing wrong with this. I'm not knocking Marvel for doing it. I'm just saying when this type of thing happens, it makes putting things on a timeline very confusing. And then there's some lesser issues, but still important. The multiverse is making it hard to place some things. I mean, you look at Loki. Do you place Loki's series after Endgame, since technically it happened because of the time heist? Do you place it after Avengers, since technically the Loki variant was created due to what happened in the Avengers movie? Or do you just place it anywhere you want, since most of it is happening at the end of time? For convenience, Marvel has placed in the Disney Plus timeline Loki after Endgame. But really, it almost doesn't belong on the timeline. Likewise, What If? What If happens or is possible to happen because of the events of Loki, but really it's not even 616 universe. It's different universes. So, we're going to see this, the more there's multiverse stories, is it just gets a little tricky to put it in a linear timeline on something as simple as Disney Plus. And then the last thing, which is not a big deal, but it's worth noting, is some of Phase 4 doesn't happen in Phase 4. Black Widow actually happens after Civil War, and I Am Groot wraps around. Some episodes happen before Guardians 2 and some happen after Guardians 2. But the point is they're not in Phase 4, or the majority of what we would call Phase 4. So now, taking all this into consideration, let's look at what the fans, I believe, myself included, would have assumed the timeline is, if not for a Disney Plus timeline telling us different. If we just took all the facts that we've heard here, things like, what did the creative team tell us? What does the movie tell us? What do the cultural celebrations tell us? This would probably be the timeline. So let's go through this and see. Avengers Endgame, we know, is October 2023. That's easy. WandaVision, about 3 weeks later, so November 2023. Now, Eternals, this could shift around a few months, but I think most fans place it, in 2023 because it's supposed to be 5 years after Infinity War. And again, we know it is a winter, late fall type movie. Shang-Chi, that's easy, right? Qingming Festival. So March, April timeframe. Falcon and Winter Soldier is about 6 months after Endgame. That one's easy. We talked about earlier that Moon Knight can be placed definitively based on the phases of the moon in June of 2024. Now, She-Hulk is tricky, but based on Jessica Gao's comments that it happens, soon after Shang-Chi, then I'm placing it in the June to August timeframe. Now, why the 3-month gap there? Well, if you remember in episode 1, it immediately jumps back in time about a couple months earlier. So let's say 2 to 3 months earlier. So I'm saying that the majority, therefore, of episode 1, which is kind of the flashback, would be in June, let's say, which puts that part very close to Shang-Chi. And we'll just say the rest of it's happening in August. Now, we will learn more when Wong shows up, because that will probably give us an idea of are Wong's appearances before or after No Way Home. So at this point, it is hard to totally pin down, but I guess the real key I'm trying to make here, or point I'm trying to make is it's supposed to be close to Shang-Chi. So even if it shifts here and there, basically it's around Shang-Chi timeframe. Spider-Man Far From Home, again, June, July timeframe, his summer break. No Way Home, we talked about the fact, has a long time span, all the way to December. Then we have Hawkeye in Christmas. Now, again, Multiverse of Madness, going off Sam Raimi, would be based in February 2025, a few months after No Way Home. And finally, Ms. Marvel, based on the Eid celebration in June of 2025. So, there you have it. I think that's roughly within a few month deviation where most fans would place things. At least would place them if we hadn't been given some different facts from the Disney Plus timeline. So let's look at what Disney Plus has said. Yikes. Right? I mean, that's pretty different. Again, I'm going to go back. This is what I think fans think, and that's what Disney Plus thinks. Wow. Okay. Well, let's see what we get here. Disney Plus looks like they keep Avengers Endgame where we would expect, WandaVision where we would expect. Then we jump straight to Falcon and the Winter Soldier. That's the next thing they have on their timeline. We know that's April to June. Okay. Now, Far From Home does appear on the Disney Plus timeline just only in a few locales, but it is in Japan. So we know when Disney is going to place it. And this is really important because having this on the timeline tells us a lot about some of the things following. So still June to July timeframe, but after Far From Home is Shang-Chi. That is very interesting. Now, there are a few, or at least one, Easter egg that would put Shang-Chi in July. On the bus fight, there's a poster that mentions July. But, that's certainly not when the Qingming Festival is. Now, No Way Home, really, Shang-Chi, until No Way Home shows up in the timeline, we're not going to know for sure where Marvel puts it. So it could switch it with Shang-Chi since they're both July. So we'll just have to wait and see. But I just put it here. It doesn't really matter, though, whether it's before or after Shang-Chi per se. It's just a guess at this point. But then comes Eternals. So after Shang-Chi, they have Eternals. Well, we are well past November of 2023. And we're well past 5 years from Thanos snapping his fingers. So very interesting. And then Eternals, right after Eternals is Multiverse of Madness, which... Well, that was why I was saying Disney pretty much is saying that Multiverse of Madness happens during No Way Home because they're putting it before Hawkeye. Remember, Sam Raimi placed it in 2025, several months after No Way Home. But Disney Plus says, no, it is actually before Hawkeye. So then we have Hawkeye and Christmas. Then Moon Knight. Remember how now we see why Muhammad Diab was so sad and so disappointed is Disney Plus is saying, hey, we're putting this in 2025. And there are some hints and some Easter eggs that it could take place in April. And I've done a video on a lot of these things, so you can go watch the videos for details. But, it's not that April placement is terrible. It just clearly goes against what Muhammad Diab had laid out. Then after Moon Knight is She-Hulk. Very interesting. Now, we just don't know enough to firmly place it somewhere. But the reason I made it February to May is I think the placement is where the main part of the series is going to occur. So therefore, the flashback is going to be before that. So what I'm saying is She-Hulk, the main portions are going to be in May. But that episode 1 flashback, well, we'll push that to February because it was a few months earlier. But again, it's kind of a guess at this point. We need a little more information from later episodes, and I think Wong's appearance will really help out a lot. And then finally, Ms. Marvel. Now, there's nothing in the timeline that says Ms. Marvel couldn't be in June, like the Eid celebration, but again, there's so many things in the episodes itself that make it seem like it's in September, the beginning of her school year. not the end. So, whew. So let's really quickly summarize these issues here. So we have three entities, three movies or shows that have a cultural, festival celebration in them, but don't occur when that festival or celebration actually happens in the real world. That's confusing. We have at least three that don't follow what the creator said. Multiverse of Madness goes against what Sam Raimi said. Moon Knight goes way against Mohammed Diab's original plan. And She-Hulk, I mean, Jessica Gao said it happens not long after Shang-Chi. But this is pretty far after Shang-Chi. That's really a problem. So again, can we trust the creative team or do we trust the timeline? Then we have things like Eternals. It seems to go against the dialogue in the movie. In fact, actually, it kind of goes against what Nate Moore said because it's not as close to Far From Home as he implied. They've moved it after Shang-Chi. I guess it. Well, the reason it's got to be in an October time frame is if you look at the fact there's pumpkins in the movie and there's winter clothes, fall clothes. There's no way it's in July. It's not in the middle of the year. It's not a summer movie. And then lastly, Multiverse of Madness happens inside of No Way Home. That's confusing. And then finally, you have the multiverse titles, What If and Loki that I didn't even put on here. It just wasn't worth putting on. But technically, Disney lists them after Endgame. So, wow. So I guess I can definitely understand why there are fans that just really don't like this Disney Plus timeline for the reasons I just went over. It goes against all the different things that they've heard along the way. And then suddenly something shows up in Disney Plus and it's completely different than what they expected. So what do we do with this then? I mean, it's interesting. I think Marvel is probably sitting back going, hey, this is what we've always intended. Why are people so upset? I don't know that they're understanding the things that I brought up in this video and really processing, we're upset because you're surprising us over and over again. These placements shouldn't be so shocking. They should be like, oh, yeah, that's what I thought. Oh, yep, that's what I thought. Each time one pops in. Instead, every time one pops in, we go, what? So Marvel can fix this by addressing some of the issues I've mentioned. But if they continue to let the creative teams go into interviews without information, if they continue to use cultural events that don't relate to the timing of the show or movie, if they continue to use dialogue that's confusing, then Phase 5 is going to be another confusing mess. So at the end of the day, every fan has got to decide what they want to do. I do not think Marvel is going to back away from this timeline. I just don't. I think things may shift around a bit when we get a little bit more information, but the bottom line is Marvel is not changing. So, you either stick to your own timeline, which is fine, or you use Marvel's timeline, or you use some combination of the two. But it's just disappointing. I wish Marvel would take care of some of these external factors that are making their timeline seem way more confusing than it actually is. So I hope this has helped. I hope you found it interesting. It really helped me putting it together and to get my thoughts in order around this. More to come because more things are going to be showing up on the timeline. Thor, Love and Thunder will be showing up before long. By the way, my prediction is it'll be the last thing. It'll be after Miss Marvel, but who knows, right? It might be before WandaVision at this point. So we'll see. But if you don't mind, you can like this video. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. There's lots more videos you can watch. And in the meantime, continue to enjoy the ever-growing, ever-expanding Marvel Cinematic Universe.